This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The autumn of 1958 brought an unusual stillness to the mountains of Monroe County, West Virginia. In the remote valley known as Whispering Hollow, where morning mist clung to the ridges like cobwebs and the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away through treacherous mountain roads, the Tannhauser family had operated a small general store and trading post for over 30 years. What happened to Mordecai and Zelda Tannhauser during that October would become one of the most carefully suppressed investigations in state history, a case that officials still refuse to discuss even today. Mordecai Tannhauser was 62 years old in 1958, a taciturn man who had built his reputation on fair dealing and an uncanny ability to procure hard-to-find items for the mountain communities scattered throughout the region. The Tannhauser trading post served customers across a 50-mile radius, from coal miners needing specialized equipment to isolated farming families seeking everything from medicine to machinery parts. Mordecai's wife Zelda, 58, managed the store's financial records with meticulous precision, maintaining ledgers that documented not just transactions, but the complex web of credit barter and personal relationships that sustained commerce in these remote mountains. The trading post itself was a substantial 2-story building constructed of local stone and timber, built in 1926 to replace an earlier structure destroyed by fire. The main floor housed the retail operation, shelves lined with everything from canned goods and farming supplies to hunting equipment and patent medicines. The upper floor contained the family's living quarters and a secure storage area where Mordecai kept valuable or sensitive merchandise. Behind the building, a series of warehouses and outbuildings provided storage for larger items and seasonal goods. What made the Tannhauser operation unique in the region was Mordecai's willingness to deal in items that other merchants avoided. Mining equipment salvaged from abandoned operations, military surplus from the recent war, and specialized tools for trades that operated in legal gray areas. Mordecai's inventory reflected the complex needs of communities where conventional commerce often fell short. This willingness to accommodate unusual requests had built him a loyal customer base, but had also attracted attention from individuals whose business dealings were less than legitimate. The first indication that something might be wrong came from Ezra Beckwith, a coal hauler who made regular deliveries to the trading post. Beckwith's route took him through Whispering Hollow every 2 weeks, carrying supplies that Mordecai ordered from distributors in Charleston and Beckley. On October 14, 1958, Beckwith arrived at the trading post for a scheduled delivery and found the building closed, with no explanation posted and no response to his calls and knocking. This was highly unusual, as Mordecai was known for his reliability and had never failed to meet a scheduled delivery in the 30-plus years Beckwith had known him. More concerning was the absence of any indication where the Tannhausers might have gone or when they might return. The family car was still parked behind the building, and there were no signs that they had prepared for any extended absence. Beckwith's concern deepened when he noticed other details that seemed inconsistent with the planned trip. The trading post's exterior windows were all shuttered and secured, but this had been done hastily. Some of the shutters hung crooked, and hardware had been left scattered around the building. More troubling was evidence that someone had been moving heavy items from the building recently. Deep furrows in the dirt suggested that substantial loads had been dragged from the trading post toward the tree line at the back of the property. Unable to complete his delivery, Beckwith drove to the nearest telephone, located at a crossroads store 15 miles away, and contacted the Monroe County Sheriff's Department. His report was logged by Deputy Luther Oakes, who noted that Beckwith seemed genuinely concerned, but initially viewed the situation as probably involving some family emergency or business trip that the Tannhausers had failed to communicate to their customers. Deputy Oakes drove out to Whispering Hollow the following day to conduct a welfare check. His initial impression was that the trading post appeared to have been closed deliberately rather than abandoned. The building was securely locked, inventory was still neatly arranged on the shelves, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. However, a more thorough examination revealed details that made him increasingly uneasy about the Tannhausers' disappearance. The deputy's report, filed on October 16, 1958, and preserved in the Monroe County Archives, documents several observations that would later prove significant. The trading post's cash register contained the normal amount of working capital that Mordecai typically kept on hand, ruling out robbery as an obvious motive. The family's personal belongings were still in their upstairs living quarters, including Zelda's jewelry and Mordecai's collection of valuable pocket watches. Most telling, the business ledgers that Zelda maintained religiously showed entries dated as late as October 12th, just 2 days before Beckwith discovered the building closed. However, Deputy Oakes also noted inconsistencies that suggested the closure had been neither sudden nor entirely voluntary. The store's perishable inventory had been carefully removed. Dairy products, fresh produce, and other items that would spoil quickly were completely absent, though the ledgers showed they should have been in stock. This suggested that someone had taken time to clear out items that would create problems if left unattended for an extended period. More puzzling was the condition of the upstairs living quarters. While most of the Tannhausers' belongings remained in place, closer examination revealed that certain personal items were missing, clothing appropriate for travel, toiletries, and a leather satchel that neighbors knew Mordecai used for carrying important papers. Yet other valuable and portable items had been left behind, creating an inconsistent pattern that made it difficult to determine whether the couple had planned their departure. Deputy Oakes's investigation expanded to interviews with neighbors and regular customers, trying to establish when the Tannhausers had last been seen and whether they had mentioned any travel plans or family emergencies. This canvass revealed that the couple had been conducting business normally as late as October 11th, when Cornelius Wagner, a local farmer, had purchased grain and discussed plans for a hunting equipment order that was supposed to arrive the following week. Wagner told Deputy Oakes that Mordecai had seemed normal during their interaction, though perhaps slightly distracted. More significantly, Wagner mentioned seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the trading post during his visit, a dark sedan with out-of-state license plates that he had assumed belonged to a traveling customer. This detail became more important when other neighbors reported seeing the same or similar vehicle in the area on multiple occasions during the week preceding the Tannhausers' disappearance. The repeated presence of an unknown vehicle suggested that the Tannhausers might have been dealing with customers from outside their normal trading area, possibly related to the specialized or sensitive merchandise that formed a significant part of Mordecai's business. Deputy Oakes attempted to trace these visitors through the trading post's customer records, but found that Mordecai's bookkeeping system, while thorough for regular customers, was more circumspect about transactions involving people from outside the immediate region. The investigation took a more serious turn when Deputy Oakes discovered evidence that the Tannhausers' disappearance might not have been voluntary. During a detailed search of the trading post's storage areas, he found signs that someone had conducted a systematic search of the premises after the building had been locked up. Inventory had been moved and rearranged, filing cabinets had been opened and their contents scattered, and storage boxes had been opened and hastily repacked. Most concerning was the discovery of what appeared to be bloodstains on the floor of one of the storage rooms. The stains had been partially cleaned, but traces remained visible, particularly in the cracks between floorboards. This evidence suggested that violence might have occurred on the premises, contradicting the initial impression that the Tannhausers had left voluntarily. Deputy Oakes immediately contacted Sheriff Crawford Thorne and requested assistance from the state police. The investigation was elevated to a potential homicide case, and Detective Sergeant Roland Fairfax was assigned to lead the expanded inquiry. Fairfax was an experienced investigator with a background in cases involving organized crime and illegal commerce, experience that would prove relevant as the investigation uncovered the complex web of relationships that surrounded the Tannhauser trading post. Detective Fairfax's first step was to secure the crime scene and conduct a thorough forensic examination of the trading post. Working with technicians from the state police laboratory, he documented the evidence of searching and the bloodstains that Deputy Oakes had discovered. More detailed analysis revealed additional traces of violence, scuff marks on walls that suggested a struggle, damaged furniture that had been moved to conceal the damage, and traces of what appeared to be restraint marks on wooden surfaces in the storage area. The forensic examination also revealed evidence that the perpetrators had taken considerable time to clean up after their activities. Chemical analysis of the floor where bloodstains were found showed that industrial-strength cleaning agents had been used in an attempt to remove all traces of the evidence. This level of preparation suggested that the crimes had been committed by individuals with experience in concealing evidence, rather than by opportunistic criminals acting impulsively. Further investigation of the crime scene revealed a methodical pattern that spoke to the perpetrator's familiarity with law enforcement procedures. Fingerprints had been systematically wiped from all surfaces that would normally retain them. Personal papers had been sorted through with obvious care, suggesting the perpetrators were looking for specific documents rather than simply vandalizing the premises. Most telling was the discovery of surveillance equipment, small listening devices hidden in various locations throughout the trading post, indicating that the Tannhausers' conversations and business dealings had been monitored for some time before their disappearance. The sophistication of this surveillance operation was beyond anything that local criminals would have had access to. The equipment was military-grade, similar to devices used by intelligence agencies for monitoring foreign operatives. This discovery added a new dimension to the investigation, suggesting that the Tannhausers had been targeted not just as obstacles to a criminal enterprise, but as subjects of a coordinated intelligence operation. Detective Fairfax expanded his investigation to include interviews with federal postal inspectors, who confirmed that mail delivery to the trading post had been irregular in the weeks preceding the disappearance. Several registered packages and certified letters had been returned to senders when delivery attempts failed, but postal workers reported that this was unusual for the Tannhausers, who normally maintained very regular contact with their business correspondents. More significantly, postal inspectors revealed that they had received inquiries from federal agencies about mail patterns to the trading post. FBI agents had requested information about the volume and origins of mail delivered to the Tannhausers, particularly packages that might contain equipment or technical specifications. This federal interest in the trading post's mail traffic provided additional evidence that the Tannhausers had been under surveillance as part of a larger investigation. The detectives' canvass of the surrounding area produced additional witnesses who had observed unusual activity in Whispering Hollow during October 1958. Jeremiah Caldwell, who operated a small sawmill about 5 miles from the trading post, reported seeing helicopter flights over the valley on at least 3 occasions during the week before the disappearance. These flights occurred at night and followed patterns that suggested surveillance rather than routine transportation. Caldwell's observations were corroborated by other residents who had noted the unusual helicopter activity. The aircraft bore no visible markings and operated with minimal lighting, characteristics consistent with military or intelligence operations. Local authorities had no record of authorized helicopter flights in the area during this period, suggesting that the surveillance was being conducted by federal agencies operating outside normal jurisdictional boundaries. Additional interviews revealed that the Tannhausers had been receiving visits from strangers for several weeks before their disappearance. These visitors did not fit the profile of typical customers. They arrived in expensive vehicles, wore business attire inappropriate for the rural setting, and conducted their meetings with Mordecai in private rather than in the public areas of the trading post. Nathaniel Hornsby, who delivered propane and heating oil to rural properties in the area, had encountered several of these visitors during his regular rounds. He described them as government types, well-dressed, professional, and obviously uncomfortable in the rural mountain environment. More significantly, Hornsby observed that these visitors seemed more interested in the trading post's storage facilities and records than in making purchases. The pattern of federal involvement that emerged from these interviews suggested that the Tannhausers had become unwitting participants in a complex operation involving multiple agencies and competing interests. The couple's legitimate business activities had apparently intersected with federal investigations in ways that ultimately made them targets for elimination by criminal organizations seeking to protect their operations. Detective Fairfax's attempts to coordinate with federal authorities became increasingly frustrating as the investigation progressed. FBI agents acknowledged their interest in the case, but refused to share information about their surveillance of the trading post or their investigation of the equipment trafficking operation. More troubling was evidence that federal agencies were actively working to impede the local investigation rather than simply maintaining secrecy about their own activities. Key witnesses reported being contacted by federal agents who advised them not to cooperate with local law enforcement. Cornelius Wagoner, the farmer who had been one of the last people to see the Tannhausers alive, was visited by FBI agents who informed him that his cooperation with the local investigation could compromise national security operations. Similar warnings were delivered to other witnesses, effectively creating a wall of silence around the case. This pattern of witness intimidation extended beyond simple requests for silence. Several individuals who had provided information to Detective Fairfax reported receiving anonymous threats, warning them to cease their cooperation with the investigation. Jeremiah Caldwell, the sawmill operator who had observed the helicopter surveillance, found his equipment vandalized after speaking with police. The message was clear. Local residents who continued to assist the investigation would face consequences. The intimidation campaign was sophisticated and well coordinated, suggesting that it was being directed by individuals with extensive resources and experience in suppressing investigations. The timing and targets of the threats indicated detailed knowledge of the investigation's progress and the identity of witnesses who had provided useful information. This suggested that federal agents were either directing the intimidation effort or providing information to those who were. Detective Fairfax's investigation revealed additional evidence of the criminal organization's extensive operations throughout the region. Bank records obtained through court orders showed that equipment dealers across multiple states had received large cash payments from accounts controlled by front companies connected to Dmitry Kozlov's operation. These payments totaled several $100,000, indicating a criminal enterprise operating on a massive scale. The financial investigation also revealed connections between the equipment trafficking operation and other criminal activities. Several of the front companies used to launder money from equipment sales were also involved in illegal arms trafficking, drug distribution, and money laundering for foreign criminal organizations. This web of criminal activity extended far beyond the Appalachian region, encompassing operations in major cities across the eastern United States. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that some of these criminal enterprises had connections to foreign intelligence agencies hostile to American interests. Financial records showed payments originating from accounts controlled by Eastern European governments and organizations known to be involved in espionage and sabotage operations against American targets. The equipment being acquired through the trafficking network was being assembled into packages suitable for use in major infrastructure attacks. This international dimension of the criminal operation explained the federal government's intense interest in suppressing local investigations. The Tannhauser case was not simply a matter of rural crime, but part of a broader counterintelligence operation aimed at disrupting foreign efforts to acquire American military technology and conduct sabotage operations within the United States. However, this legitimate national security concern was being used to justify the abandonment of law enforcement principles and the protection of criminal organizations from prosecution. Detective Fairfax's investigation was further complicated by evidence that federal agencies were not unified in their approach to the case. While FBI agents were actively working to suppress the local investigation, other federal agencies appeared to be conducting their own parallel inquiries that sometimes conflicted with FBI objectives. Military intelligence officers, customs investigators, and agents from other federal agencies all appeared to have interests in different aspects of the criminal operation. This lack of coordination among federal agencies created opportunities for the criminal organization to exploit conflicts between competing investigations. Evidence emerged that Dmitry Kozlov and his associates had deliberately played different federal agencies against each other, providing selective information to some while concealing their activities from others. This manipulation had allowed the organization to operate successfully for years, despite being under investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. The complex web of federal investigations also explained why local law enforcement had been excluded from the case. Rather than risk exposing their operations through coordination with local authorities, federal agencies had chosen to conduct their investigations in complete secrecy. This decision had the unintended consequence of protecting the criminal organization from prosecution. As federal agencies were more interested in gathering intelligence than in building prosecutable criminal cases. Detective Fairfax's efforts to understand the federal agency's objectives led him to interview former federal employees who were willing to discuss their knowledge of similar operations. These interviews revealed that the equipment trafficking investigation was part of a broader effort to identify and disrupt foreign intelligence networks operating within the United States. The goal was not necessarily to prosecute individual criminals, but to gather information that could be used to counter foreign espionage and sabotage operations. This intelligence-gathering approach explained the federal government's willingness to allow criminal activity to continue rather than risk exposing ongoing operations through prosecutions. From the perspective of national security agencies, the information gained by monitoring criminal organizations was more valuable than the deterrent effect of arresting individual criminals. This approach, however, came at the cost of abandoning traditional law enforcement objectives and allowing serious crimes to go unpunished. The human cost of this approach was illustrated by the Tannhauser case and similar incidents throughout the region. Mordecai and Zelda Tannhauser had been sacrificed to protect intelligence operations that may or may not have achieved their intended objectives. Their deaths, and those of other victims throughout the region, were considered acceptable losses in the broader context of Cold War intelligence operations. Detective Fairfax's investigation revealed that at least 15 other individuals had disappeared under similar circumstances throughout West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and southwestern Virginia during the late 1950s. These victims included equipment dealers, federal investigators, journalists, and others who had become involved in the trafficking investigation or had acquired information about federal intelligence operations. The systematic elimination of these individuals demonstrated the criminal organization's ruthlessness and the federal government's apparent willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of intelligence objectives. The pattern of disappearances was carefully documented in Detective Fairfax's personal files, which included detailed profiles of each victim and analysis of the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. This documentation revealed that the criminal organization had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and eliminating threats to their operations. Victims were typically isolated from their normal support networks before being eliminated, and their disappearances were staged to appear accidental or voluntary. The organization's methods for disposing of victims were also sophisticated and effective. Bodies were rarely recovered, and when they were found, the circumstances made it difficult to establish cause of death or connect the victims to the larger criminal operation. This systematic approach to eliminating evidence suggested that the organization included individuals with extensive experience in law enforcement or military operations, possibly former federal agents or military personnel who had been recruited or compromised by foreign intelligence agencies. Detective Fairfax's investigation was terminated abruptly in March 1959, when he was informed that the case was being transferred to federal jurisdiction and that all local investigative activities were to cease immediately. This termination came shortly after Fairfax had indicated that he was close to identifying key figures in the criminal organization and establishing connections between the equipment trafficking operation and foreign intelligence agencies. The timing of the investigation's termination suggested that federal agencies were more concerned with protecting their intelligence operations than with achieving justice for the victims. Rather than risk exposure of ongoing counterintelligence activities, federal authorities chose to suppress the local investigation and allow the criminal organization to escape prosecution. This decision represented a fundamental abandonment of law enforcement principles in favor of intelligence objectives. The transfer of the case to federal jurisdiction was accompanied by explicit instructions that all evidence and documentation be turned over to FBI agents and that local law enforcement personnel refrain from any further investigation or discussion of the case. Detective Fairfax was specifically warned that unauthorized disclosure of case information could result in federal prosecution for interfering with national security operations. However, Detective Fairfax continued to maintain personal files related to the case, believing that the information might eventually be useful if political conditions changed sufficiently to allow a proper investigation. These files, hidden in his home for over a decade, provide the most complete documentation of the criminal organization's activities and the federal government's role in suppressing investigations. The detective's personal files reveal additional disturbing details about the systematic nature of the cover-up operation. Federal agencies had not simply suppressed the investigation, but had actively worked to eliminate physical evidence and discredit witnesses who might pose threats to their intelligence operations. This effort included the deliberate destruction of documents, the intimidation of potential witnesses, and the manipulation of media coverage to minimize public interest in the case. One of the most significant revelations in Fairfax's personal files concerns the fate of the physical evidence collected during his investigation. Rather than being preserved for potential future use, all forensic evidence was ordered destroyed by federal authorities, who claimed that it posed security risks if it fell into the wrong hands. This destruction included blood samples, fingerprints, surveillance equipment, and other materials that could have been crucial for future prosecutions. The systematic destruction of evidence was accompanied by a coordinated effort to discredit the investigation and its findings. Federal agencies spread disinformation suggesting that Detective Fairfax had exceeded his authority and that his investigation was based on unreliable sources and contaminated evidence. This disinformation campaign was designed to prevent other law enforcement agencies from taking the case seriously and to discourage journalists or researchers from investigating the disappearances. Fairfax's files also document his attempts to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in other states where similar disappearances had occurred. These efforts revealed that federal authorities had intervened in multiple investigations throughout the region using the same methods to suppress local law enforcement efforts and protect the criminal organization from prosecution. The pattern of federal intervention was so consistent that it suggested a coordinated policy rather than ad hoc decisions by individual agents or agencies. The detective's correspondence with colleagues in other jurisdictions reveals the broader scope of the criminal organization's activities and the federal government's efforts to conceal them. Equipment trafficking operations were active in at least 8 states, involving hundreds of dealers and thousands of individual transactions. The total value of equipment acquired through these operations was estimated at several $millions, representing one of the largest criminal enterprises of its type in American history. More disturbing was evidence that the criminal organization had successfully recruited federal agents and other government personnel to provide protection and intelligence about law enforcement activities. Fairfax's investigation identified at least 6 federal employees who appeared to be providing information to the criminal organization, including agents from the FBI, Customs Service, and military intelligence agencies. This internal corruption explained how the organization was able to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts and eliminate witnesses before they could provide damaging testimony. The recruitment of federal personnel appeared to involve a combination of monetary incentives and ideological motivation. Some agents were apparently motivated by payments from the criminal organization, while others seemed to believe that protecting the organization served broader intelligence objectives related to Cold War espionage operations. This ideological motivation made it particularly difficult to identify and eliminate the corruption, as agents could justify their actions as serving national security interests. Detective Fairfax's investigation was also hampered by the compartmentalized nature of federal intelligence operations, which made it difficult to determine which agencies were legitimately investigating the criminal organization and which were protecting it. Different federal agencies often had conflicting objectives and competing priorities, creating opportunities for criminal organizations to exploit these conflicts for their own protection. The complexity of these interagency relationships became apparent when Fairfax attempted to verify the credentials and authority of federal agents who had intervened in his investigation. Some of the individuals who claimed to be FBI agents could not be confirmed as legitimate federal employees, suggesting that the criminal organization was using impersonators to intimidate witnesses and manipulate local law enforcement. This use of false credentials made it nearly impossible for local authorities to distinguish between legitimate federal oversight and criminal interference. Fairfax's personal files include detailed profiles of more than 30 individuals who appeared to be connected to the criminal organization, including equipment dealers, transportation specialists, financial intermediaries, and security personnel. These profiles reveal a sophisticated network that included individuals with backgrounds in military intelligence, law enforcement, and international commerce. The organization's recruitment practices appeared to target individuals with specialized skills and access to sensitive information or restricted materials. The geographic scope of the organization's activities extended far beyond the Appalachian region where the Tannhausers lived and worked. Operations were documented in major cities throughout the eastern United States, with evidence of connections to similar organizations operating on the West Coast and in the Midwest. This national scope suggested that the equipment trafficking operation was part of a larger network of criminal and intelligence activities that encompassed much of the continental United States. International connections were even more extensive, with evidence of relationships between the American criminal organization and similar groups operating in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries. Financial records showed payments flowing between these organizations, suggesting coordination of activities and sharing of resources and intelligence. This international dimension reinforced the federal government's claims that national security interests were involved in the case, but also raised questions about whether American intelligence agencies were adequately protecting national interests or were being manipulated by foreign organizations. The equipment being acquired through the trafficking network was assembled into packages that could be used for various purposes, including legitimate mining and construction operations, but also for sabotage operations against American infrastructure targets. Technical analysis conducted by military experts revealed that the equipment packages contained everything necessary to conduct major attacks against power plants, transportation systems, and communication networks. The potential for such attacks provided justification for the federal government's intense interest in the case, but also raised questions about why the trafficking operation had been allowed to continue for so long. Detective Fairfax's investigation revealed that federal agencies had been aware of the equipment trafficking operation for several years before the Tannhauser disappearance, but had chosen to monitor rather than disrupt the operation in hopes of gathering intelligence about foreign espionage activities. This decision to allow criminal activity to continue for intelligence purposes had directly contributed to the deaths of the Tannhausers and other victims throughout the region. The intelligence value of monitoring the criminal organization was questionable, as the organization appeared to be more successful at gathering information about American intelligence activities than federal agencies were at penetrating the organization's operations. Evidence suggests that foreign intelligence agencies were using the equipment trafficking operation as a means of identifying and recruiting American intelligence personnel, rather than simply acquiring military equipment for sabotage operations. This counterintelligence failure represented a significant embarrassment for federal agencies, providing additional motivation for suppressing investigations that might reveal the extent of their operational failures. Rather than acknowledge their mistakes and work to correct them, federal agencies chose to classify the entire operation and suppress any information that might reveal their role in allowing the criminal organization to operate successfully for years. The human cost of this decision extended far beyond the Tannhausers and other direct victims of the criminal organization. Families throughout the region lived with uncertainty about the fate of missing relatives, never knowing whether their loved ones had been victims of criminal violence or had simply chosen to disappear. Communities lost trust in federal law enforcement agencies, knowing that federal interests would take precedence over local justice concerns. This erosion of trust had lasting consequences for federal law enforcement efforts in the region. Local residents became reluctant to cooperate with federal investigations, knowing that their cooperation might put them at risk if federal priorities changed. Local law enforcement agencies became suspicious of federal requests for assistance or information, having learned that federal agencies were not reliable partners in pursuing justice. The long-term consequences of the Tannhauser case extended beyond law enforcement to affect broader relationships between federal and local governments in the Appalachian region. Federal development programs and social initiatives were viewed with suspicion by local communities who had learned that federal agencies were willing to sacrifice local interests for broader policy objectives. This suspicion undermined federal efforts to address poverty, educational needs, and infrastructure development in the region for decades. Academic researchers and journalists who attempted to study the case faced systematic obstruction from federal agencies who continued to classify documents and restrict access to information decades after the original events. Freedom of Information Act requests were denied on national security grounds, with agencies claiming that disclosure of even basic information about the case could compromise ongoing intelligence operations or reveal methods and sources that remained sensitive. The few researchers who managed to obtain significant information about the case often found their work suppressed through legal challenges, funding restrictions, or direct intimidation. Several academics reported receiving visits from federal agents who advised them to cease their research on grounds that it could interfere with national security operations. Publishers and editors were similarly discouraged from releasing material related to the case, with some reporting pressure from advertisers and government agencies to avoid coverage of the topic. This systematic suppression of research and journalism created a climate of self-censorship that extended far beyond the specific details of the Tannhauser case. Researchers learned to avoid topics that might attract federal attention, even when those topics involved legitimate academic inquiry into historical events. The chilling effect on academic freedom and journalistic independence represented another casualty of the federal government's decision to prioritize intelligence objectives over transparency and accountability. The technological advances of subsequent decades provided new opportunities for investigating the case, but federal agencies adapted their suppression methods to address these new capabilities. Digital records and databases were protected by sophisticated security measures that prevented unauthorized access. Electronic surveillance capabilities were used to monitor researchers and journalists who showed interest in the case, allowing federal agencies to anticipate and counter potential revelations before they could be published. The few attempts that have been made to use advanced forensic techniques to investigate the case have been frustrated by the systematic destruction of physical evidence that occurred decades earlier. DNA analysis, advanced fingerprinting techniques, and other modern investigative methods cannot be applied when the original evidence has been deliberately destroyed. This destruction of evidence has effectively immunized the perpetrators from prosecution, even if political conditions change sufficiently to allow renewed investigation. The classification of documents related to the case has been periodically reviewed and renewed, with federal agencies consistently concluding that disclosure would continue to pose unacceptable risks to national security. These renewals occur automatically and receive minimal scrutiny from oversight bodies, ensuring that the case remains hidden from public view indefinitely. The classification system has thus become a mechanism for permanent suppression rather than temporary protection of sensitive information. Surviving family members of the victims have been largely unsuccessful in their efforts to obtain information about their relatives' disappearances. Legal challenges to the classification of documents have been consistently rejected by courts that defer to federal agencies' claims about national security sensitivities. Compensation programs for victims of federal government misconduct have specifically excluded cases related to intelligence operations, leaving families without recourse for the government's role in their relatives' deaths. The international ramifications of the case continue to influence American foreign policy and intelligence operations. Knowledge that foreign intelligence agencies successfully penetrated American criminal organizations and recruited federal personnel has led to lasting changes in counterintelligence procedures and international cooperation protocols. These changes represent acknowledgment that the case involved significant security failures, even though the specific details of those failures remain classified. The precedent established by the federal government's handling of the Tannhauser case has been applied to numerous subsequent cases involving conflicts between law enforcement and intelligence objectives. The principle that intelligence operations take precedence over criminal justice has become institutionalized within federal agencies, ensuring that similar suppressions of investigations will occur whenever federal authorities believe that prosecutions might compromise intelligence activities. This institutionalization of suppression has created a parallel justice system in which federal agencies determine which crimes will be prosecuted and which will be ignored based on their impact on intelligence operations. This system operates outside normal constitutional and legal constraints, accountable only to executive branch officials who share similar priorities and perspectives. The lack of judicial or legislative oversight ensures that decisions to suppress investigations are rarely questioned or reviewed. The mountain communities where these events occurred have developed their own mechanisms for preserving memory and seeking justice outside official channels. Oral histories passed down through families maintain knowledge of the disappearances and the federal government's role in suppressing investigations. Local historical societies and community organizations continue to collect information about the case despite official discouragement and the absence of formal records. These unofficial preservation efforts represent a form of resistance to the federal government's attempts to control historical memory and narrative. By maintaining their own records and continuing to discuss the case despite official pressure for silence, local communities assert their right to remember and commemorate their own experiences regardless of federal preferences. This grassroots historical preservation has ensured that knowledge of the case survives even though official documentation has been suppressed. The persistence of local memory has occasionally created problems for federal agencies when renewed interest in the case threatens to attract wider attention. Efforts to commemorate victims or establish historical markers have been quietly discouraged through various administrative mechanisms. Tourism initiatives that might draw attention to the case have been redirected or canceled. Even academic conferences or workshops that might include discussion of the case have faced pressure to modify their programs or relocate to different venues. The continuing federal sensitivity to the case, more than 60 years after the original events, suggests that significant secrets remain hidden or that the precedent of suppression is considered too valuable to abandon. The specific nature of these ongoing concerns remains classified, but their persistence indicates that the case continues to have relevance for contemporary intelligence operations and federal law enforcement policies. For the residents of Monroe County and similar rural communities throughout Appalachia, the Tannhauser case serves as a perpetual reminder of their vulnerability to forces beyond their control or understanding. The knowledge that federal agencies are willing to sacrifice local interests for broader policy objectives affects community attitudes toward government programs, law enforcement cooperation, and civic participation. This legacy of suspicion and alienation represents perhaps the most lasting damage caused by the federal government's handling of the case. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing short-term intelligence objectives over long-term institutional integrity and democratic accountability. The decision to suppress investigations and abandon prosecutions for intelligence purposes may have served immediate federal interests, but it has created lasting damage to institutional credibility and public trust that continues to affect federal law enforcement effectiveness decades later. In the hollows and ridges of West Virginia, where the morning mist still rises from valleys that hold their secrets close, the story of Mordecai and Zelda Tannhauser remains embedded in the landscape and the memory of those who choose to remember. The federal government's efforts to erase this history have been only partially successful, leaving behind a legacy of questions, suspicions, and unresolved grief that no amount of classification or suppression can fully eliminate. The mountains endure, and with them the knowledge that some truths are too important to be buried completely, regardless of how powerful the forces that seek to hide them. The voices of the victims may have been silenced, but their story continues to resonate in the wind that moves through the trees where they once lived and worked, serving as a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that the pursuit of truth sometimes requires generations rather than years. Today, as hikers walk the trails that wind through what was once Whispering Hollow, they pass through a landscape that appears peaceful and unchanged by the events that occurred there more than half a century ago. But beneath the surface tranquility lies a darker history of violence, corruption, and institutional failure that continues to shape the relationship between government and citizen in ways that few fully understand. The case remains officially closed, classified, and forgotten by most who have the power to reopen it. But in the collective memory of mountain communities, in the whispered stories passed down through families, and in the questions that still echo through the hollows, the truth about what happened to Mordecai and Zelda Tannhauser lives on, waiting for a time when justice might finally be possible and the full story can finally be told. Detective Fairfax's investigation into the Tannhausers' business relationships revealed the complex nature of their commercial activities. While the trading post's regular retail operations were entirely legitimate, Mordecai had also served as an intermediary for transactions involving surplus military equipment, industrial machinery from abandoned mining operations, and other goods that existed in a gray area between legal and illegal commerce. These activities had brought him into contact with individuals whose backgrounds and motivations were difficult to determine. The detective's review of business records showed that Mordecai had recently been involved in negotiations for the sale of a substantial quantity of mining equipment that had been salvaged from a closed operation in neighboring Kentucky. The equipment included explosives, handling gear, specialized communication devices, and heavy machinery that could have applications beyond legitimate mining operations. The potential buyers for this equipment were represented by intermediaries whose identities were not clearly documented in Mordecai's records. More troubling was evidence that this transaction had attracted attention from federal law enforcement agencies. Detective Fairfax discovered that FBI agents had been making inquiries about the Tannhauser trading post in the weeks preceding the disappearance, apparently as part of an investigation into illegal arms trafficking in the Appalachian region. The timing of these inquiries, coming so close to the Tannhausers' disappearance, suggested a possible connection between the federal investigation and the crimes at the trading post. Detective Fairfax's attempts to coordinate with federal authorities proved frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful. FBI agents acknowledged their interest in the Tannhauser operation, but declined to share information about their investigation, citing national security concerns and ongoing operations that could be compromised by disclosure. This lack of cooperation limited Fairfax's ability to understand the full context of the crimes and identify potential suspects. However, the detective was able to piece together information about some of the individuals who had been in contact with Mordecai regarding the mining equipment sale. Through interviews with other equipment dealers and salvage operators in the region, Fairfax learned that the potential buyers were represented by a man named Dmitry Kozlov, who claimed to be acquiring equipment for legitimate mining operations in South America. Kozlov had been conducting similar negotiations with multiple dealers throughout West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, always offering cash payments and seeking to complete transactions quickly and quietly. The investigation revealed that Kozlov's background was largely fabricated. The mining company he claimed to represent did not exist, the South American operations he described could not be verified, and his personal history contained inconsistencies that suggested he was using an assumed identity. More concerning was evidence that Kozlov had connections to individuals involved in international arms trafficking and other criminal activities that extended far beyond the Appalachian region. Detective Fairfax's efforts to locate and interview Kozlov proved unsuccessful. The man had been staying at various hotels and boarding houses throughout the region, always paying in cash and providing minimal identification. After the Tannhausers' disappearance, he had vanished completely, leaving no forwarding address or contact information. Attempts to trace him through the vehicle registrations that neighbors had observed yielded no results. The license plates had apparently been stolen or fabricated. The investigation expanded to examine other equipment dealers and salvage operators who had been contacted by Kozlov or his associates. This broader inquiry revealed a disturbing pattern of intimidation and violence directed at individuals who had been unwilling to participate in the illicit transactions. Several dealers reported being threatened when they refused to sell equipment without proper documentation or asked too many questions about the intended use of the materials. One dealer, Thaddeus McCready, who operated a salvage yard near Huntington, told Detective Fairfax that he had been approached by associates of Kozlov who made it clear that refusal to cooperate would have serious consequences. When McCready declined to sell explosive handling equipment without proper federal licenses, his yard was vandalized and his family received anonymous threats. Similar patterns of intimidation were reported by other dealers who had been contacted as part of the same equipment acquisition effort. This information suggested that the Tannhausers might have been killed because they posed a threat to a larger criminal operation, either by refusing to cooperate or by possessing information that could compromise the organization's activities. The systematic nature of the intimidation campaign indicated that the perpetrators were operating as part of a well-organized group with significant resources and experience in using violence to achieve their objectives. Detective Fairfax's investigation was further complicated by the discovery that several other individuals connected to the equipment trafficking investigation had also disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Two other equipment dealers, both from neighboring states, had vanished from their homes in the weeks following the Tannhauser disappearance. A federal investigator who had been working on the case had died in what was officially ruled an automobile accident, but which occurred under circumstances that raised questions about whether the crash had been deliberate. These additional disappearances and the suspicious death of the federal investigator suggested that the criminal organization was systematically eliminating witnesses and potential sources of evidence. The scope and sophistication of this effort indicated that the group had significant resources and connections that extended into law enforcement and government agencies. Detective Fairfax's investigation was effectively terminated in early 1959 when his superiors informed him that the case was being transferred to federal jurisdiction. This transfer was accompanied by orders that all evidence and documentation related to the case be turned over to FBI agents and that local law enforcement cease all investigative activities related to the Tannhauser disappearance. Fairfax was specifically instructed not to discuss the case with media representatives or other outside parties. The reasons for this federal takeover were never clearly explained to local authorities. Official communications cited national security concerns and the need to coordinate the investigation with other federal cases, but provided no details about the specific nature of these concerns. The sudden termination of the local investigation, combined with the classification of all evidence, effectively ended any possibility of achieving justice for the Tannhauser family or providing closure to their community. However, Detective Fairfax continued to maintain personal files related to the case, documenting information that he believed might someday be useful if the investigation were reopened. These files, discovered after Fairfax's death in 1973, provide additional details about the case that were not included in the official reports. Among the most significant revelations in these personal files was evidence that the federal government's interest in the case extended beyond the equipment trafficking investigation. According to Fairfax's notes, FBI agents had indicated that the criminal organization involved in the Tannhauser case was connected to foreign intelligence agencies that were attempting to acquire military equipment and technology for use against American interests. The equipment that Kozlov had been seeking to purchase included items that could be used in sabotage operations against American infrastructure, particularly in the energy and transportation sectors that were vital to the Cold War defense effort. This international dimension helped explain the federal government's decision to classify the investigation and suppress local law enforcement efforts. The case was apparently part of a larger counterintelligence operation aimed at disrupting foreign efforts to acquire American military technology. However, This national security priority came at the cost of abandoning any effort to achieve justice for the individual victims of the criminal organization's activities. Fairfax's personal files also contain information about his own efforts to continue investigating the case despite official orders to cease all activities. Working quietly and using his own resources, Fairfax attempted to trace the criminal organization's activities in other states and gather evidence that might eventually be used to prosecute those responsible for the Tannhauser murders and other crimes. These unofficial investigations revealed that the organization had been operating throughout the Appalachian region for several years, using similar methods to acquire equipment and eliminate witnesses who might threaten their operations. The pattern of activities suggested that the group had been building a substantial inventory of military and industrial equipment, possibly in preparation for major sabotage operations or for transfer to foreign allies. Fairfax's notes indicate that he had identified at least 12 other individuals who had disappeared under circumstances similar to those surrounding the Tannhauser case. These victims included equipment dealers, salvage operators, and federal investigators who had been working on related cases. The systematic elimination of these individuals demonstrated the organization's ruthlessness and its ability to operate across state lines without detection by law enforcement agencies. Perhaps most significantly, Fairfax's investigation suggested that the criminal organization had sources within federal law enforcement agencies that provided advance warning of investigations and helped the group evade capture. This internal corruption explained how the organization was able to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts and eliminate witnesses before they could provide testimony that might lead to prosecutions. The corruption apparently extended to the highest levels of federal law enforcement, making it impossible for honest investigators like Fairfax to pursue the case through normal channels. This institutional corruption also explained the government's decision to classify the investigation rather than pursue prosecutions. Revealing the full extent of the organization's activities would have exposed the corruption within federal agencies and compromised ongoing counterintelligence operations. Fairfax's personal investigation came to an abrupt end in 1963 when he was found dead in his home under circumstances that were officially ruled a heart attack. However, friends and colleagues noted that Fairfax had been in good health and had recently expressed concerns about being followed and receiving threatening phone calls. The timing of his death, coming shortly after he had indicated that he was close to identifying key figures in the criminal organization, raised suspicions that he had been murdered to prevent him from exposing the conspiracy. Following Fairfax's death, his personal files related to the Tannhauser case disappeared from his home before they could be recovered by family members or law enforcement colleagues. The only record of his unofficial investigation comes from copies of documents that he had given to a trusted friend, retired State Police Captain Vernon Blackstone, who kept them hidden for over a decade before turning them over to researchers in the 1970s. The Tannhauser trading post remained closed and secured for several years after the disappearance. In 1961, the property was quietly purchased by a company with ties to federal agencies, ostensibly for use as a storage facility for government equipment. However, no such use ever materialized, and the building was demolished in 1964, eliminating any remaining physical evidence related to the crimes. Local residents noted that the demolition was conducted by workers from outside the area who completed the job quickly and thoroughly, removing not only the building but also the foundations and even the access road leading to the property. The site was then reforested, effectively erasing all evidence that a trading post had ever existed in Whispering Hollow. The thoroughness of this cleanup operation confirmed suspicions that the government's interest in suppressing the case extended beyond protecting ongoing investigations. The complete elimination of physical evidence suggested that officials were concerned about the possibility that future investigators might uncover information that could compromise national security or expose corruption within federal agencies. In the decades following the Tannhauser disappearance, occasional efforts have been made to reopen the investigation or obtain disclosure of classified documents related to the case. These efforts have been consistently unsuccessful, with government agencies citing national security exemptions and claiming that relevant documents have been lost or destroyed due to routine records disposal policies. The most significant attempt to uncover the truth about the case was made in 1978 by investigative journalist Marcus Thornfield, who had become interested in the case while researching a book about Cold War espionage activities in rural America. Thornfield's investigation revealed additional information about the criminal organization's activities and its connections to foreign intelligence agencies, but his work was cut short when he died in an automobile accident under circumstances that mirrored the suspicious death of the federal investigator who had worked on the original case. Thornfield's research files were seized by federal agents immediately after his death, ostensibly to protect national security information that might have been compromised. His publisher canceled plans to release his book, citing legal concerns about potential disclosure of classified information. The manuscript was never released, and copies of Thornfield's research materials have never been recovered. The pattern of suspicious deaths and suppressed investigations has continued to surround the Tannhauser case. In 1985, a retired FBI agent named Hamilton Sinclair, who had worked on Cold War counterintelligence cases, indicated that he was prepared to provide information about the criminal organization's activities and its connections to federal agencies. Sinclair died of an apparent suicide before he could be interviewed, leaving behind a note claiming that he was unable to live with the guilt of his role in covering up the organization's crimes. These repeated attempts to suppress information about the case have only strengthened suspicions that the Tannhauser disappearance was part of a larger conspiracy involving foreign intelligence agencies and corruption within the American government. The systematic elimination of witnesses and investigators suggests that powerful interests remain committed to preventing disclosure of the truth, even decades after the original crimes were committed. Today, the site where the Tannhauser trading post once operated remains part of a state forest, accessible only by hiking trails that give no indication of the property's former use. The valley known as Whispering Hollow has been largely forgotten by all but the most dedicated researchers and the few surviving family members who continue to seek answers about what happened to Mordecai and Zelda Tannhauser. Local residents who remember the case are reluctant to discuss it, partly due to the passage of time, but also because of a persistent belief that talking about the disappearance might attract unwanted attention from the same forces that were responsible for the original crimes. This culture of silence has been reinforced by occasional visits from federal agents who have continued to monitor the area and question anyone who shows too much interest in the case. The few attempts that have been made to commemorate the Tannhausers or acknowledge their fate have been quietly discouraged by local authorities. Plans for a memorial marker were abandoned after officials cited concerns about attracting vandalism to the remote location. A proposal to name a section of state forest in honor of the couple was rejected without explanation by the State Forestry Service. This ongoing effort to erase the memory of the Tannhauser case reflects the continuing sensitivity of whatever truth lies behind their disappearance. The fact that government agencies remain active in suppressing information about events that occurred over 60 years ago suggests that the case involves secrets that are still considered vital to national security, or that could expose ongoing criminal activities. The investigation files that remain accessible provide only fragments of the larger story. Key documents have been heavily redacted or removed entirely from public access. Witness statements have been sealed indefinitely. Physical evidence has been destroyed or transferred to secure facilities where it remains beyond the reach of researchers or family members, seeking answers. What emerges from the available evidence is a picture of a criminal conspiracy that operated on a scale and with a level of sophistication that far exceeded anything that local law enforcement agencies were equipped to handle. The organization's ability to eliminate witnesses, corrupt federal investigators, and suppress government investigations for decades demonstrates connections and resources that extended far beyond a simple equipment trafficking operation. The international dimension of the case, involving foreign intelligence agencies and Cold War espionage activities, helps explain the government's continued commitment to secrecy. However, it does not justify the abandonment of efforts to achieve justice for the victims or provide closure to their families. The decision to prioritize national security concerns over law enforcement has created a precedent that has protected criminal organizations and corrupt officials from accountability for their actions. The Tannhauser case remains a symbol of the conflicts between individual justice and institutional power that characterized the Cold War era. The systematic suppression of evidence and the elimination of witnesses demonstrate the lengths to which government agencies were willing to go to protect what they considered vital national interests. However, these actions also undermined the rule of law and the principle that all individuals, regardless of their political connections or institutional affiliations, should be held accountable for their crimes. For the residents of Monroe County and the broader Appalachian region, the Tannhauser case serves as a reminder of their vulnerability to forces beyond their understanding or control. The disappearance of Mordecai and Zelda Tannhauser was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of exploitation and violence that targeted rural communities precisely because they lacked the political power to demand justice or protection from their government. The mountains of West Virginia continue to guard their secrets, and the mist that rises from Whispering Hollow each morning seems to carry with it the whispers of voices that will never be heard. In the silence of the forest, where the Tannhauser trading post once stood, there is only the wind moving through the trees and the distant echo of questions that may never find answers. The case file remains open in the official records, though no active investigation has been conducted for decades. The notation, "suspended pending development of new evidence," suggests that authorities acknowledge the incomplete nature of the investigation. But the practical reality is that the case has been abandoned, the evidence has been destroyed, the witnesses are dead, and the perpetrators have disappeared into history. Perhaps that is exactly what someone intended from the beginning. In the shadowy world of Cold War espionage and criminal conspiracy, the complete elimination of inconvenient truths was often more valuable than the pursuit of justice. The Tannhauser family became casualties not just of criminal violence, but of a system that valued secrecy above accountability and institutional protection above individual rights. The mountains remember, even when the records have been sealed and the witnesses silenced. In the deep hollows of Appalachia, where isolation and silence have always been tools of both protection and oppression, the story of what happened in Whispering Hollow continues to resonate. It serves as a reminder that some secrets are too dangerous to reveal, but too important to forget entirely. Those who venture into the forest where the trading post once stood sometimes report hearing sounds that have no obvious source. Voices calling out across the valley, the creak of wooden floors in buildings that no longer exist, the distant sound of vehicles on roads that have been reclaimed by the wilderness. These phenomena are easily dismissed as imagination or the natural sounds of the forest, but they persist as echoes of a tragedy that has never been properly acknowledged or resolved. The truth about what happened to Mordecai and Zelda Tannhauser may be buried too deeply to ever be recovered. The forces that destroyed them were powerful enough to eliminate evidence, corrupt investigations, and silence witnesses for over half a century. But the questions their disappearance raised about justice, accountability, and the proper limits of government power remain as relevant today as they were in 1958. In the end, the Tannhauser case stands as a testament to the capacity of institutional power to shape reality according to its needs, regardless of the cost in human lives or moral principles. It is a story that officials refuse to discuss, not because it is ancient history, but because it reveals truths about power and corruption that remain dangerous to those who would prefer that such truths stay buried in the mist-covered hollows of Appalachian memory.